In the news tonight, His Majesty leads a farewell ceremony for Lebanese President Michel Aoun at the conclusion of a visit to Jordan for talks on bilateral ties and common regional challenges. Syrian workmen begin to mend the destruction of the war that has shattered Aleppo's priceless historical heritage outside the ancient citadel and in the famous covered souk. And U.S. National Security Advisor Michael Flynn resigns after revelations that he had discussed U.S. sanctions on Russia with the Russian ambassador to the U.S. before Donald Trump took office. Good evening and welcome to a new edition of the news. Here are the details. Lebanese President Michel Aoun concluded a brief visit to Jordan in which he held talks with His Majesty the King. The talks focused on bilateral relations and regional developments, including the impact of the Syria crisis on both Jordan and Lebanon. During a one-on-one encounter, followed by an expanded meeting at Basman Palace in the presence of senior officials from both sides, His Majesty said he looked forward to enhanced relations with Lebanon and its people. King Abdullah and Aoun agreed to hold a meeting of the joint Jordanian-Lebanese Higher Committee in the nearest possible opportunity to prepare the groundwork for a bilateral free trade agreement. They also agreed to convene a Jordanian-Lebanese business forum to work on activating a maritime route between Lebanese ports and the port of Aqaba and to promote integration in the finance, technology, industry, tourism and agriculture sectors. His Majesty and Aoun also discussed security and civil defense cooperation and the need to increase the capabilities of the Lebanese army. On Syria, they agreed that a ceasefire in Syria must continue to help find a political solution to the crisis in the framework of the Geneva peace talks. The meeting also dealt with the war on terror and the upcoming Arab summit in Jordan. Aoun hailed the kingdom's efforts towards Syrian refugees and said the burdens resulting from the Syria crisis on both Lebanon and Jordan demand world assistance and fulfilled pledges by the international community. Prime Minister Hani al-Mulki received a Turkish trade delegation led by President of the Union of Turkish Chambers and Commodity Exchanges, Rifat Oglu, to look into prospects of boosting trade ties between the two countries. Mulki pointed to challenges facing commercial exchange as a consequence of trade route interruptions between the two countries, which he said calls for innovative alternatives to transform those challenges into opportunities. Oglu is accompanied by a delegation of 50 representatives of leading Turkish companies visiting the kingdom to promote investments and cooperation with the Jordanian side. A free trade agreement between Jordan and Turkey and visa-free travel have helped boost relations between the two sides. And Interior Minister Ghalib al-Zu'bi welcomed U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration Simon Henshaw and discussed with him ways to strengthen political, economic and security ties and address regional developments, mainly the situation in Syria. The discussion dealt with the two countries' stand vis-à-vis regional issues and ongoing coordination to resolve the various challenges. Russia's foreign ministry said UN Special Envoy for Syria, Staffan de Mistura, is to hold talks in Russia on Thursday, the 16th. The ministry's statement said Mistura's discussions with Russian officials will focus on forming a unified delegation of the Syrian opposition for the talks in Geneva. A new round of UN-backed peace talks on the Syrian conflict are due to begin in Geneva next week. On the ground, Turkish Prime Minister Ben Ali Yildirim announced that the Syrian town of Al-Bab is now largely under the control of Turkey-backed rebels. Speaking to members of his ruling AK party in parliament, Yildirim said the aim of taking control of Al-Bab is to prevent the opening of corridors from territories controlled by terrorist organizations to Turkey. Backed by Turkish special forces, tanks and warplanes, the Syrian rebels swept into northern Syria in August in an operation dubbed Euphrates Shield to push Daesh from Turkey's border and stop the advance of Kurdish fighters. The rebels have been pressing a major offensive on Al-Bab, 30 kilometers south of the Turkish border, for weeks, putting themselves at risk of coming in direct conflict with the Syrian army, who are closing in on the city from the south. In Aleppo, meanwhile, workmen are starting to mend the destruction of the war that has shattered the city's priceless historical heritage. About 20 volunteers, some wearing United Nations Development Program aprons, are sorting through the rubble-strewn square outside Aleppo's ancient citadel and in the city's famous covered souk. About 30% of the old city suffered catastrophic damage in the fighting that ended in December. Here's a story.
Determined to restore Aleppo and preserve Syria's past, a group of volunteers working tirelessly to save what they can. Amid the smell of burning, they continue the painstaking work of mending this destruction, caused by a civil war that's shattered the old city's priceless heritage. Aleppo is one of the Middle East's great historic centres, a source of national pride and identity, as well as tourist revenue back in happier times. Fighting erupted here in 2012, a year after the rising against President Bashar al-Assad. The rebels quickly took control of Aleppo's eastern districts and much of the old city. Clashes in 2012 and 2013 converted the souks around the mosque into one of the country's fiercest front lines. Rebels finally forced to surrender their enclave in December after months of intense fighting. Around 30% of the old city suffered catastrophic damage. But despite the destruction, many people are now starting to return, clearing rubble and waiting for electricity to be reinstalled or to see places that were too dangerous to visit, hoping that one day soon the ruins will be replaced with tourists.
In Iraq, at least 2 people were killed when a car bomb exploded in an industrial area in western Baghdad. 8 people were also wounded in the blast, which went off near car repair shops in the Bayad district of the capital. There was no immediate claim of responsibility for the attack. Several recent attacks in Iraq have been claimed by Daesh, including a suicide bomb attack at a restaurant in eastern Mosul last Friday that killed 4 people. Daesh terrorists have now been cleared off the land in Mosul in an Iraqi army offensive, but the reign of terror and mismanagement have devastated farmers and exacerbated the country's food security problem. An estimated 70% of farmers fled when Daesh took over, and those who stayed, either to join the terrorist group or out of fear, faced heavy taxation. Iraq's representative for the UN Food and Agriculture Organization says farmers need all the support they can get.
This is what's left of Sami Yahuna's farm. Nineveh was Iraq's most productive farming region before the arrival of Islamic State, producing around 20% of the country's total wheat output and 32% of barley. The militants may have been pushed out of this northern corner, but the devastation they've left behind will remain for years. Seizing the country's agricultural heartland has ruined farmers and exacerbated the country's food security problem. Sami used to sell around 100 tons of wheat per year. Now he lives in a small trailer and drives a taxi to barely survive.
How am I going to be able to rebuild this again? Our hope is that international organisations help us, but as far as the government, no, we don't have hope. If they want to compensate me, they will need to compensate a lot of people, all the way from Basra to Dahuk.
The militants also seized 1.1 million tons of wheat that was in government silos and sold 40% of agricultural machinery to raise money for their activities. Unexploded mines lie in the fields. Ensuring food security has consistently been one of the central government's biggest and most pressing challenges. But farmers say the government is not offering much hope to rebuild their businesses, with most resources directed at driving the militants out of Mosul.
According to latest polls on the French elections, centrist Emmanuel Macron is projected to knock embattled former Prime Minister François Fillon out of the race for presidency. The independent candidate is set to also beat far-right's Marine Le Pen in the second runoff. Macron is seen winning 22% of the vote in the first round on April 23rd against 20% for his conservative rival. The top-placed candidates will face each other in a second vote on May 7th, when Macron is predicted to win 64%. Yesterday, Macron took his campaign to Algiers, addressing French expatriates trying to win their votes. U.S. President Donald Trump named Lieutenant Joseph Keith Kellogg Jr. as acting National Security Advisor after National Security Advisor Michael Flynn resigned. Flynn submitted his resignation following revelations that he had discussed U.S. sanctions on Russia with the Russian ambassador to the U.S. before Trump took office and misled the vice president about the conversations. The resignation came hours after it was reported that the Justice Department had warned the White House weeks ago that Flynn could be vulnerable to blackmail for contacts with the Russian ambassador. Meanwhile, a senior U.S. Senate Republican said that the resignation of Flynn would add momentum to congressional investigations of Russia's involvement in the 2016 U.S. election. Senator Bob Corker also said that Flynn may need to testify at a congressional hearing on the matter. North Korea said it rejected the United Nations Security Council's statement on its latest missile launch and declared that all of its tests were self-defense measures designed to protect its people. The UN Security Council yesterday denounced the North's missile launch, urging members to redouble efforts to enforce sanctions against the reclusive state. However, it gave no indication of any action it might take. Addressing a conference on disarmament in Geneva, North Korea's ambassador to the United Nations said the missile launch was part of self-defense measures. Japan's disarmament ambassador urged Pyongyang to comply with Security Council resolutions, and the U.S. called for collective action to hold North Korea accountable for its nuclear and ballistic missile tests.
The successful test launch of medium to long-range missile on February 12 is a part of self-defense measures. In this respect, my delegation strongly rejects the latest statement of UN Security Council and all UN resolutions against my country.
We strongly condemn the launch and urge the DPRK to comply with the relevant UNSC resolutions and other international commitments without taking further provocative actions.
North Korea's weapons programs represent a clear threat to the national security of every country in its region and have for some time. As its program continues to grow, it threatens the security of every country beyond its region as well.
It is that time of year where romance is in the air and couples celebrating Valentine's Day with chocolates, roses and gifts. But Paris, considered by many as the most romantic city in the world, was buzzing. Locals and tourists alike celebrated, whether through strolling along the Seine River, climbing the Eiffel Tower, or fastening love locks on the Pont Neuf Bridge. The city's patisseries and chocolatiers were also busy. Despite terrorist attacks over the past years, France is still the most visited country in the world. And in Croatia, 3 skydivers marked Valentine's Day with a jump over the heart-shaped island of Galešnak. The trio traveled to the heart of Croatia so they could take to the air above the postcard perfect island known as the Island of Love because of its heart shape. A rare artwork by Austrian artist Gustav Klimt is expected to fetch up to $45 million when it's put on the block in London next month at Sotheby's. According to the auction house, Bauerngarten ranks among the finest works by the artist ever to appear on the market. The painting was first exhibited in Vienna in 1908, helping make the artist Klimt a sensation. Klimt's work is part of the Impressionist and Modern Art sale, which is due to take place on March 1st in London. Klimt himself was a modernist artist whose works have fetched millions in previous sales. To the world of fashion and the New York Fashion Week, styles collided on the runway at a joint fashion show of hip and edgy label Monsi and elegant, sophisticated fashion house Oscar de la Renta. Monsi's fall 2017 collection included deconstructed ruffled blouses, off-the-shoulder coat dresses with asymmetrical hemlines, and military-inspired parkas. Sequin skirts and dresses were topped with sweaters, often bearing the shoulder. Velvet was used for evening as well as casual looks such as jumper suits. Oscar de la Renta look was more luxurious and simple, with clean and feminine silhouettes. Full-skirted cocktail gowns and flowy gowns were shown, with casual-looking pant numbers in between. The color palette included red, fuchsia, and black and white. The New York Fashion Week wraps up on Thursday. The Champions League makes its long-awaited return this week, with the first 4 last 16 ties taking place across Europe. As we speak, Barcelona are playing at Paris Saint-Germain in the French capital. Barca knocked PSG out of the quarterfinals in 2013 and 2015, but Barca coach warned that the French champions are now more structured. The French side are now guided by Spaniard Unai Emery, who knows Barca very well from his days of coaching Valencia and Sevilla. While Barca can count on their magic trio of Lionel Messi, Luis Suarez and Neymar, PSG will rely on Uruguay striker Edinson Cavani, who is in the form of his life, having scored 25 league goals this season. So far, PSG are leading with 1-0. A federal judge cleared the way for a U.S. government lawsuit seeking nearly $100 million in damages from former professional cyclist Lance Armstrong to go to trial. The U.S. Justice Department has accused Armstrong of defrauding the government by accepting millions of dollars in sponsorship money from the U.S. Postal Service as he led the team to a string of Tour de France victories while doping. Armstrong was stripped of his 7 Tour titles and banned for life from bicycle racing in 2012 by the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency. And finally, cold weather continues for the rest of tonight, with thundery rain and hail in the northern and central regions, gradually extending to other parts of the kingdom. Snowfall is also expected in the late hours on hilly areas 1,000 meters above sea level. Similar conditions prevail tomorrow, with continued rainfall and hail across most regions. Winds will be westerly brisk, stirring dust in the eastern parts of the kingdom. The Gulf of Aqaba should expect relatively warm conditions tomorrow, with northerly moderate to brisk winds and slightly high seas. The weatherman warns of poor visibility due to fog and dust and of flash floods in low-lying areas. He knows the temperatures forecast for tonight and tomorrow. And to close, here's a reminder of the day's top stories. His Majesty leads a farewell ceremony for Lebanese President Michel Aoun at the conclusion of a visit to Jordan for talks on bilateral ties and common regional challenges. Syrian workmen begin to mend the destruction of the war that has shattered Aleppo's priceless historical heritage outside the ancient citadel and in the famous covered souk. And U.S. National Security Advisor Michael Flynn resigns after revelations that he has discussed U.S. sanctions on Russia with the Russian ambassador to the U.S. before Donald Trump took office. And with this, we come to the end of this edition of the news. I'm Ali Abdul Khan. Thank you for joining us and have a good night.